Let me come to Dr. Siew. So, Doctor, what happens to the human body the moment it re-enters Earth's gravity? Considering the high speed of the space capsule and the sudden transition from microgravity to full gravity. So, what physiological changes takes place in the body during this phase?
So once you've splashed back down on Earth and kind of got over the initial shock of re-entry, the first thing is probably going to be your blood pressure. So astronauts, when they're up in space, often have a lower blood pressure. And normally your eye, when you're standing up, your heart has to beat very fast, your blood vessel constrict as it's trying to keep blood going to your head. The astronauts may have adapted to microgravity and may not have retained this ability, so they have to relearn it almost. The body has to kind of kick back into it. So sometimes when astronauts are back on Earth, they can get episodes of low blood pressure, which causes them to faint. Other things that would have happened, they would have had partial deconditioning of their muscles. So you can lose up to 1% bone and muscle mass per month in spaceflight. So when they come back, they can have strength issues, bone mineral loss, and so they'll need to do several months of reconditioning to try to get them back up to a normal, healthier position. Same for the heart, it can shrink over time. So the astronauts do quite a lot of exercise when they're up in the space station to prevent the heart from shrinking. But they're going to be the main things. The other thing is going to be disorientation, so their sense of balance. So the vestibular system or their inner ear is not going to be used and have to readjust to gravity. And so balance can be a bit of an issue. And I've heard of astronauts for the first month forgetting that there's gravity and letting go of cups and they just fall and crash on the ground. So I think there's just some things to get used to in the first kind of month when you're back.
We'll talk more about their recovery process. What are the medical treatments involved? The physiotherapy involved to make them accustomed to Earth life again. Before that, I'd actually like to know, how does an astronaut actually physically feel during descent at such speeds? Is it comparable to the drop on a giant wheel ride, or is there any other sensation that best describes it?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Not having experienced it myself, I imagine it's like the most intense roller coaster ever. I imagine it's going to get hotter inside the module, so that's going to be definitely something that's going to be particularly around turbulence within there as well. They're going to potentially undergo high G forces, so fluid shifts as well. So they're probably having to train to clench, maintain. Maybe the main things that I would have considered when they're kind of re-entry, not too dissimilar to when they're taking off, they're experiencing high Gs as they're trying to decelerate.
Let's take a look at a graphics of NASA's single space flight record holders. Arun, please cue in the graphics. Thank you very much. So this will actually set stage for my next question. So here on screen, we have NASA's record holders for the longest single space flight. So there we have Frank Rubio, 371 days, Mark Van Der Hey, 355 days, Scott Kelly, 340 days, Christina Koch, 328 days, Peggy Whitson, 289 days, Andrew Morgan, 272 days. We have three people, Janet Epps, Matthew Dominic, Mike Barrett, 235 days, and we have Michael Lopez Alegria, 215 days. So, Arun, we can have this graphics on air for a while. So, these astronauts actually spent an extended period in space, pushing the limits of human endurance. So, my question is to Dr. Siu, what happens to astronauts' body when they spend such a long time in microgravity? We know that Dr. Salomurthy just covered it. So, could you please add more to what he said, and what are the biggest physical, physiological, mental challenges they face during their mission and after returning to Earth?
So perhaps the most interesting of those on the graph there is Scott Kelly. So Scott Kelly is actually an identical twin, and his brother Mark Kelly was a retired astronaut. So they took part in a very unique experiment where we had one astronaut up on the space station for one full year, another astronaut on the ground, and they did lots and lots and lots of measurements. Everything from the amount of mutations in their DNA to the difference in gene expression, the health of their immune systems, and the microbiome, so all the different bacteria, virus, etc. And some of the things they found were that there was definitely alterations in the immune system. So space in particular seems to kind of dampen down your immune system. One surprising finding was that your telomeres, these kind of sections of DNA at the end of your chromosomes that can correlate with kind of how old your cells are, actually got longer in space flight, which was kind of unexpected. We normally think of space as kind of modeling aging, so you see kind of a lot of the same symptoms as you get with rapid aging, and they got actually quite long during space flight. The main things that were pointed out previously are the bone loss, the muscle loss. That's the one that everyone kind of looks for. But you also get something called space-acquired neuroocular syndrome. So this is where, because of the fluid shift up from the legs and the body up towards the head, you actually get a buildup of pressure in the eyes, and it can slightly change the shape of your eyeball. And so actually, a lot of astronauts go up with full, perfect vision, coming back needing glasses. And then it can also cause these things called woolly spots. So you start to see kind of deformations of the microvasculature at the back of the eye. So that's certainly one thing that we see. There's something else that's given the nickname space brain. So as you're getting lots of this space radiation coming at you, and that can cause cognitive issues with people. There's a few of the bits and pieces that are kind of on the emerging side where we see retroviruses like herpes can be reactivated within you. We start to see some things with the microbiome on the space station where they start expressing drug resistant genes. And so there's a lot of kind of things yet to be explored. And one of the areas that our work looked on was kidney stones. So astronauts have a 7 to 14 times higher risk of kidney stones during spaceflight, and that risk persists when they return to Earth, with about a 2 to 7-fold higher risk in the first year after returning to space. And so that's another thing that they can face as well.
Dr. Siew, so space flight studies, including the one that you did, have provided insights that can benefit not just astronauts but also people on Earth facing similar, health challenges. So, with NASA and ISRO focusing on longer missions, these findings are more relevant than ever. So, how can space medicine research, particularly in areas like bone density loss, cardiovascular health, and kidney function, contribute to improving medical treatments for people on Earth?
So, space can be quite a good model for bone disease, muscle disease, heart disease. Patients who are on bed rest, for example, so those in intensive care, some of the situations can be quite similar. So, some of the treatments we develop in space could be easily redeployed or hopefully redeployed here on Earth. One example would be for the kidney. So, we showed in our work that the kidney, under spaceflight conditions, simulating a trip to Mars, would suggest that there's going to be long-term permanent damage to the kidney. Now, this is very likely not being detected at the moment. It's what we would call subclinical. But over a long mission, like a 2.5 year to 3 year trip, where you're receiving lots of this space radiation, and to just emphasize how bad this thing can be for you, it's about 90% of hydrogen nuclei, so protons, about 16 to 10% can be helium nuclei, and then 1% are going to be made up of something called HZE, or these heavy charged elementary particles. And these are atoms as large as iron, traveling near the speed of light coming from exploding stars in our galaxy going through our bodies. It can be quite damaging. So, in our research, one of our hopes is that if we can develop drugs that would prevent damage to the kidneys of astronauts, those could be redeployed for patients who are undergoing radiotherapy for cancer here on Earth. So if you are unfortunate enough to have a cancer like leukemia or bladder cancer that requires abdominal or total body radiation, the organ that will limit the dose of radiation is your kidney, because it's incredibly susceptible to this sort of damage. So if we have drugs that can increase the amount of radiation you can receive safely and preserve your kidney function, we could more effectively treat those cancers as one example of those things. Another thing would be in aging, we lose muscle mass. So anything we can do to stave off muscle loss in space flight, we would be able to help people who are getting elderly and more frail. So if you're over the age of 60, particularly if you're a woman, if you have a fall, that's one of the most likely things to kill you if you enter into the hospital. So it's about 30 to 40% can cause long-term debilitating or life or loss of life. So increasing strength of muscles in your legs, for example, is really important, and something again we can learn from spaceflight.
Dr. Siew, my last question to you again. Can you please give us a comprehensive account on the restoration process after the astronauts come back to Earth, and how is the restoration process different for women and men?
So the process, as your colleague before was highlighting, there's going to be an acute phase. So the first thing they're going to try to eliminate is any sort of issues that could be life-threatening or could lead them to kind of have any harm. So especially if they're having any issues with blood flow to the brain due to the adjustments of blood pressure. So they don't want to have them fall, faint, or if there's decreased bone mineral density, they have a high risk of fractures. They're the initial things that they're going to try and take care of. And then in the 45-day kind of window, that's when they're going to be really working on your cardiovascular health. So doing lots of sort of cardiovascular exercises, so aerobic, and then resistance exercise. They're going to try and make sure that you're building back up your muscle mass. And they'll be doing nutritional as well as exercise, try and build up some of the bone mineral density. Unfortunately, some of the things in space we haven't seen reverse in the long term. So to my knowledge, it's almost impossible to regain all your bone mineral density after spaceflight. So if you're an astronaut who's gone up for a year or for several missions, so some cosmonauts have been up for almost 1,000 days, they will have a lifelong decrease in bone mineral density. We've also seen histories from astronauts from the Canadian Space Agency where they've seen stiffening of their arteries, and that can it mimics this kind of advanced aging, and that seems to be very hard to reverse as well. In terms of men and women, there's ongoing research at the moment. So some of my colleagues are investigating effects on the reproductive tract. We know from some of Chris Mason's work over at Weill Cornell and Afshin Beheshti at Pittsburgh that there are differences in response from men and women to spaceflight. In fact, women seem to be generally a little bit more resistant to some of the stuff, particularly around the immune system. So at the moment, there's not a great deal of difference, to my knowledge, in how we recondition the astronauts after spaceflight. Um, but in the future, we may try and tailor this a bit more specifically.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Siew.